Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to your next mini lesson for British Literature, English 12 here at Jenison International Academy. Be sure to take your core downloads, and if you have questions at the end, be sure to reach out to your instructors so they can clarify those items for you. Today's lesson focuses on the eras of Restoration and Reason, the era of Enlightenment during the 18th century, and traditions and reason reigned supreme, as you will find out. After years of turmoil and upheaval, England settled happily into a time of peace, order, and prosperity. Behind the facade of tradition, however, was a radical new way of thinking. Scientific, logical, enlightened. This way of thinking would change the face of Britain. The monarchy had been restored, but in this era, reason ruled unchallenged. The coronation of Charles II in 1660 was surely a sight to behold. Samuel Pepys recorded the events in his diary, describing the crowd of 10,000 people who watched the king with his scepter in his hand under a canopy borne up by 6 silver staves carried by barons of the Cinque Ports and little bells at every end. This grand celebration signaled the beginning of a new era in England, the Restoration. Turning its back on the grim attitude of Puritan rule, England entered a lively period in which the glittering Stuart courts of Charles II set the tone for the upper-class social and political life. Charles had spent much of his long exile in France, and upon his return he tried to emulate the sophistication and splendor he observed at the court of Louis XIV. As a result, the lord and ladies of his court dressed in silks and lace, elaborate wigs, and sparkling jewels. They held elegant balls and flocked to London's newly reopened theatres, where they proved their sophistication by attending comedies of manners, plays that poked fun at the glamorous but artificial society of the royal court. Like Louis XIV, Charles was a patron of the arts and sciences, appointing John Dryden England's first official poet laureate and chartering the scientific organization known as the Royal Society. In addition, Charles reestablished Anglicanism as England's state religion. With the Restoration, however, came a realization that monarchs would have to share their authority with Parliament, whose influence had increased substantially. An astute politician, Charles at first won widespread support in Parliament, weathering a series of disasters that included the Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London a year later. Soon, however, old political rivalries resurfaced in two factions that became the nation's chief political parties, the Tories and the Whigs. The Whigs, who wanted to limit royal authority, included wealthy merchants, financiers, and some nobles. They favored leniency towards Protestant dissenters and sought to curb French expansion in Europe and North America, which they saw as a threat to England's commercial interests. The Tories, supporters of royal authority, consisted mainly of land-owning aristocrats and conservative Anglicans who had little tolerance for Protestant dissenters and no desire for war with France. Political conflict increased when Charles was succeeded in 1685 by his Catholic brother James. A blundering, tactless statesman, James II was determined to restore Roman Catholicism as England's state religion. As a result, Parliament forced James to abdicate his throne. In 1688, James' Protestant daughter Mary and her husband, the Dutch nobleman William of Orange, took the throne peacefully in what came to be known as the Glorious Revolution, a triumph of parliamentary rule over the divine rights of kings. The next year, Parliament passed the English Bill of Rights, which put specific limits on royal authority. As a Dutchman and a Protestant king, King William, who ruled alone after Mary died, was a natural enemy of Catholic France and its expansionist threats to Holland. From the first year of his reign, with Whig support, he took every opportunity to oppose the ambitions of Louis XIV with English military power, beginning a series of wars with France that some historians consider a second Hundred Years' War. A year before William's death, Parliament passed the Act of Settlement, which permanently barred Catholics from the throne. In 1702, therefore, the crown passed to Mary's Protestant sister Anne, a somewhat stodgy but undemanding ruler who faithfully tended to her royal duties. During her reign, Scotland officially united with England to form Great Britain. Outliving all 16 of her children, Anne was the last monarch in the House of Stuart. With her death in 1714, the crown passed to a distant cousin, the ruler of Hanover in Germany, who as George I became the first ruler of Britain's House of Hanover. The new king spoke no English and was viewed with contempt by many Tories, some of whom supported James II's Catholic son, James Edward Stuart. The Whigs, on the other hand, supported the new king and won his loyalty. Because of this language barrier, George I relied heavily on his Whig ministers, and Robert Walpole, the head of the Whig party, emerged as the king's prime minister, the first official to be so called, a position he continued to hold under George II, who succeeded his father in 1727. Towards the end of George II's reign, another able prime minister, William Pitt, arose on the political scene. Pitt led the nation to victories over France in the 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War, in America, which resulted in Britain's acquisition of French Canada. George II's grandson became the first British-born monarch of the House of Hanover. As George III, he sought a more active role in governing the country, but his high-handed ways antagonized many. Scornful of the Whigs, George had trouble working with nearly everyone, partly because he suffered from an illness that affected his mind and grew worse over the years. During his reign, he led Britain into some serious political blunders that ultimately resulted in the loss of the American colonies. The period, including the late 1600s and the 1700s, is called the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. It was then that people began to use scientific reasoning to understand the world. Earlier, most people had regarded natural events such as comets and eclipses as warnings from God. The new scientific way of understanding the world suggested that by applying reason, people could know the natural causes of such events. The British scientist Sir Isaac Newton set the tone for the era in his major work, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, written and published in 1687, in which he laid out a newly formulated law of gravity and motion and the methodology by which he arrived at his conclusions. Newton's scientific method, still employed today, consists of analyzing facts, developing a hypothesis, and testing that hypothesis with experimentation. Newton's findings were enormously important because they suggested that the universe operated by logical principles that humans were capable of understanding. Inspired by Newton's example, scientists searched for these principles, making all kinds of discoveries along the way. Astronomers learned that stars were not fixed but moving, and that the Milky Way was an immense collection of stars. Chemists isolated hydrogen, discovered carbon dioxide, and converted hydrogen and oxygen into water. Botanists and zoologists categorized literally millions of individual plants and animals, and in agriculture, breeding was important, as were methods for cultivating and harvesting crops. The discoveries of Newton thrilled not only scientists but also philosophers. If nature operated by simple, orderly laws that could be worked out by logic, they asked, why not human nature as well? Why couldn't scientific methods be used to predict economic trends, for instance, or to figure out what form of government was best? Believing that reasonable people could create a perfect society, philosophers such as John Locke encouraged people to use their intelligence to rid themselves of unjust authorities. Rejecting the divine right of kings, Locke proved the illogical justification for the Glorious Revolution, and later the American Revolution, by asserting the right of citizens to revolt against an unfair government. The spirit of the Enlightenment led to many improvements in living conditions. Early in the century, for instance, writer Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, wife of a British ambassador, brought back from Turkey the idea of inoculation. By the end of the 1700s, scientist Edward Jenner had developed an effective smallpox vaccination. Many British citizens lived well during the 18th century, and a few lived sumptuously. Wealthy aristocrats built lavish country estates surrounded by beautiful tended lawns and gardens. When Parliament was in session, members relocated to their London townhouses on spacious new streets and squares that had been laid out after the Great Fire. Writers, artists, politicians, and other members of society gathered daily in London's coffee houses to exchange ideas, conduct business, and gossip. Educated women sometimes held salons or private gatherings where they too could participate in the nation's intellectual life. However, as the period drew to a close and the Industrial Revolution took hold, one writer noted, "No society can be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable." Despite recurring warfare with France and the disaster of the American Revolution, the Restoration in the 18th century were a relatively stable time in Britain. The middle class grew and prospered, and ordinary men and women had more money, leisure, and education than ever before. For writers, that meant a broad new audience eager to read and willing to pay for literature. However, this audience did not have much taste for highbrow poetry full of sophisticated allusions to classics they had never read. Instead, they wanted writing that reflected their own concerns and experiences, working hard, doing right, gaining respectability, and they wanted it written in clear prose that they could understand. One enormously popular form of real-life literature was journalism. Newspapers had been around since the early 1600s, but rigid censorship, under both Charles I and Oliver Cromwell had discouraged their growth. As restrictions gradually eased, the press flourished. Daily newspapers appeared, and serials such as The Tatler and The Spectator published essays by Joseph Addison and Richard Steele that satisfied the middle-class appetite for instruction and amusement. Journalists did not simply report current events, they moralized, mocked, and gossiped, giving their opinion on everything from social manners to international politics. Journalist Daniel Defoe used his experience writing nonfiction when creating Robinson Crusoe in 1719, and it was considered by many to be England's first novel. As is typical of early novels, Defoe wrote in the familiar realistic style of a newspaper account, making it seem as if his tale of a shipwrecked man's survival on a desert island had really happened. Other writers followed with novels of their own, often modeled on nonfiction forms such as letters, for example, Pamela by Samuel Richardson, and diaries. A real-life diary, although not intended for publication, provides modern readers with one of the best glimpses of life during these times. Samuel Pepys, a prosperous middle-class Londoner, began his diary in the first year of the Restoration and kept it for 9 years. In it, he tells of the major events of the day, including the coronation of Charles II and the Great London Fire. Our next Cornell Notes and mini lesson will deal with satire and satirical voices, but this will get us started this week with the Restoration and the Enlightenment and those ideals. If you have questions, please be sure to reach out to your instructors and they'll be happy to help you out in understanding the material. Have a great week and we'll see you next time.